I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. This is joint work with Matthias Hollweg that relates to sort of my comments here, who's a colleague at Oxford. And so the title is Theory is All You Need. It's sort of a riff on the Attention is All You Need, which is the famous paper that sort of launched large language models. I mean, there's lots of work previously, obviously, around neural networks and so forth. But essentially, we're contrasting what is it that AI and large language models and other forms, other forms of AI is doing versus humans, so I'll jump right into the arguments here. So there's a lot of arguments about AI potentially having surpassed human intelligence, and so some of the, I guess, evidence that we have around that is kind of the fruit fly of comparing humans and AI was chess. But you look across chess, checkers, Go, Jeopardy, and diplomacy. AI can now outperform humans in those types of games, but also in things like kind of professional qualifications and exams. So ACT, LSAT, CPA. So these are exams for lawyers, for people doing college admissions, for accounting, and so forth. And even in areas like medical diagnosis, and there's questions about even things like decision making. And so, will AI be better at making decisions than us humans? And then maybe what's relevant for many of you as researchers, will it replace us potentially? So will researchers be replaced by large language models and AI? So I'm going to address some of these points. And so here's just sort of a graph that compares. This is Chat GPT 3.5 and 4 on various types of exams and things like that, and you can see the performance or percentile relative to kind of humans. Danny Kahneman, who's the cognitive scientist who sadly passed away a few months back, made this argument. He says, will there be anything that is reserved for human beings? He says, frankly, I don't see any reason to set limits on what AI can do. And so it's very difficult to imagine that with sufficient data, there will remain things that only humans can do. You should replace humans by algorithms whenever possible. And so that's probably the strongest argument. This is from 2018. But you can find similar arguments by many others that basically algorithms will outperform humans in terms of decision making in all kinds of domains. And so this isn't just the chess and the Go and the checkers, but this is in all forms of decision making. And probably one of the strongest arguments, Jeff Hinton, who's kind of one of the I don't know what to call them, godfathers of AI, key folks who developed a lot of the neural network models. In the 80s, argued that AI potentially has already surpassed biological intelligence. And not to be outdone, there's a set of scholars at MIT and Harvard that says that social science, so what I do, will be replaced by scientists, language models being scientists. And so I'm gonna kind of push back on this argument in various different ways. Like I said, a lot of this touches on a paper that Matthias and I have worked on, and I've got a link to it there at the end, and we'd love feedback. But basically, a lot of this goes back to this very general, almost sort of universal effort to try to understand cognition. If you go back to the first AI meeting, Matthias and I just taught an AI class earlier this year and looked at just the history of this. And at Dartmouth in 1956, there was this meeting that sort of launched that had Herbert Simon and many people. And the basic we try to sort of map or show what this general model of cognition is that tries to unify how machines think and how humans think, and argues that it's essentially the same thing. And it's basically kind of this information processing input-output model. And essentially the inputs are things like data, stimuli, information, experience, and environment, depending on which model you're looking at. And then there's something that happens in between. This is what the algorithms do. They engage in information processing, computation, and representation. And then out of that, we get some kind of outputs, decisions, and et cetera, different things. And this actually goes back to even further to Alan Turing, who argued that we could think about machines and humans as these sort of kind of learning entities. And you take the untrained infant brain and you input things, just like you take the machine and you teach it things. And so a lot of the machine learning models have this sort of metaphor that argues that there's similarity there. And there's a lot of argument that has sort of foreshadowed the current kind of AI moment that we are. Chris Anderson, who was the editor of Wired, and this piece has actually been cited in academic research, thousands of times as well, argues that, well, with all this data, we don't actually need theories anymore. Like, data is going to solve the problem. So with this sort of general model of cognition, this has been talked about for years by Newell and Simon, and here's a book that kind of foreshadows it. I'll skip this. I'm sensitive to time, so I'm going to make sure I keep track of time here. And here's sort of these types of cognitive models. There's a nice overview piece over the last 40 years, ACTAR and SOAR and other types of models, and this is a nice review piece. But I want to sort of step back and think about just more basically, how is it that a machine versus a human learns? And I think that's going to give us mileage for thinking about differences rather than similarities. I think that's important for the current moment. So if you think about a large language model, its training data is, everything that's on the internet sort of scraped, or the works of Shakespeare and stuff on Reddit and everything like that. And it's kind of, 13 trillion tokens, which is roughly equivalent of words that are kind of input into this system. So it's lots of stuff, right? And if you compare that to a human at 14K words per day, so we kind of have looked at research. So how many words does a human, say an infant or a child, encounter a day? And 17K seems to be a rough estimate. It would take roughly 2 million years for the human to encounter the same number of words as an LLM is trained in within weeks, right? So that's a huge difference, right, in terms of just the inputs, right? And if you look at the capability of the AI versus the human respectively, so what the AI is really good at is next word prediction and providing fluent text, right? But what it's also doing is it's backward looking, right? And so it's giving you essentially what you might be called, let's call it sort of Wikipedia level knowledge. So it can write indefinite Wikipedia articles about topics that it's seen in the form of the word associations that it's seen in the past. So it's a statistical exercise of how do we stochastically pull together some kind of outputs, right? Versus with humans, we have some kind of generative speech and true novelty, right? And so there's something different than sort of statistically just pulling things together. We could go back into linguistic theories by Chomsky and others to look at these types of things. But there's also an important aspect that I'll talk about here, which is kind of forward-looking theorizing. I'll give that a little bit of context. So I've got kind of this hypothetical thought experiment for a second. So imagine that there's a large language model that pops up in 1633, right when Galileo is proposing his theory of cosmology of the universe, right? And if you ask the large language model, you said, so we have this person Galileo. The large language model has been trained with all the previous works of science up to that point. If you ask this large language model, what should we think about Galileo's theory? The question is, what would it do? Does it have some forward-looking way of sort of cognition? And at the time of Galileo, obviously, the scientific consensus was that the geocentric model of the universe, that the Earth is stationary. So the LLM would input and have all that information. And the way that it would sample on that is based on the frequency. So the number of times that the geocentric view has been discussed, right? And because that's mostly what's been discussed in scientific literature at the time, that's all the knowledge it would have, right? And so that literature would argue that Galileo's wrong. All the scientific observations obviously would argue that Galileo's wrong. And everyday data, you look outside, you're like, clearly the Earth isn't moving, and it looks like the sun is going around the Earth. And so everyday observation would also say that Galileo's delusional. And so the LLM in, I don't know, so I've got a different day, or 1609, would say that, Galileo's wrong. But Galileo's point would be it wasn't about more data, which is what these AI models, like large language models, knew. It's about having the right theory, the right experiment, and the right data. I'll give that a little bit of color here in a second. And so here you have obviously a heliocentric view with a contrasted with a geocentric view. On the right, you can make predictions with it, but it still turns out that it's wrong, right? So it's great at prediction, but it's still wrong, right? So if I were to contrast this with human cognition, I'm just checking on time, the central point is that human, or you could think about biological organisms more generally, the human is making decisions about what data, stimuli, information to input, right? So with the other model that I had to offer that contrast, it's going from inputs to outputs. In this case, we have the organism deciding what are the relevant or important inputs. And there's some great studies look at other types of biological organisms there as well. And so humans, in essentially, are engaging in some kind of theoretical exercise that isn't theory independent, that isn't completely data dependent, and then making decisions about what are the relevant inputs, right? And so what humans do is they engage in essentially some form of theoretical activity. And here I'm including not only us as scientists, but also humans more generally. There's a great book by Liebenberg that goes back to sort of arguing that our evolutionary history has sort of this origins of science in terms of how humans procure food and hunt and so forth. And so there's this quasi-scientific hypothesizing that's ubiquitous in evolution. So I've been working with Stuart Kaufman, who's an evolutionary biologist, to look at the evolutionary aspects of this. And so not only us as scientists as engaging in this hypothesizing and experimentation and so forth, but humankind more generally. And children also do this. And so they theorize and they experiment. And so what we do is we create data and intervene in the world through creating some kind of experiments and causal logic. So the story that I want to just quickly work through is thinking about something like the Wright brothers. And so this is actually a famous image of a famous experiment done in Washington, D.C. in 1903. Sam Langley, who was a famous scientist, had everybody along the river, people from the New York Times and all the scientists from the East Coast coming to look at his experiment with flight. And he comes off of this ramp and he flies straight into the river. And he does this twice. And basically, people look at that and they say, okay, the scientists in particular at the time said, like, flatly heavier than air flying machines clearly aren't possible. Simon Newcomb, famous physicist at the time, flight by machines heavier is unpractical. The New York Times wrote an article at the time when this happened, said flight might be possible in 1 to 10 million years, but it's just not going to happen, right? And so here's the existing wisdom and knowledge and the data, and you can imagine asking an LLM about whether flight is possible. And lots of studies that are not done around this as well. I'm going to skip this part just in the interest of time, but of course, in the end, you have lots of scientific consensus and data and experiments and LLM and so forth saying it's not possible, but you have two bicycle mechanics who have a theory about how it might be possible, right? And so even though people were using bird data to say humans can't fly, the argument was that, well, only the large birds can't fly, so therefore humans can't fly. So there's something about weight that is important. And they said, well, we still think that flight is possible. And if we solve these three problems, lift, propulsion, and steering, we're going to be able to develop have our own kind of theory of flying. And again, this went against Lord Kelvin, Simon Newcomb, all the scientific wisdom at the time. And the argument I would make is that there's nothing so practical as a good theory, and this happens to work for us as organizational, as scholars across management and different domains, but also in the context of managers and others as well. Okay, I've got just a minute left here, so I'm gonna rush through. So here's an actual footage of so original flight there, and so and this is something that large language models and AI can't do. So whether you can observe a thing or not depends on the theory which you use. It's the theory which decides what can be observed. And so that's a quote by Albert Einstein. And so here you have not sort of data determining things, you have theory determining what is the data, right? And this is where large language models, but other AIs and simply can't handle this. And so my argument is that this emphasis on kind of prediction as intelligence, and where data is the key mechanism, so where we go from data to information to prediction to decision, isn't the right way to go. That we should instead start with theories that we have that are forward-looking or that managers have. And so for me, it's kind of theories all the way down. Theories enable awareness towards new data. They provide forward-looking causal logic. And obviously, I'm using all of these large language models and other AIs in various ways in my research. And so I think we need to, kind of capitalize on the respective strengths of humans and AI. And if you want more on this, I've got a QR code there. There's sort of a very long 45-page paper with Matthias where we sort of work through this logic and get into far more details. And if you have hard questions, I have Matthias's email. You can send them to him, not to me. But I think that's my time. So thank you. I'm open to questions in the chat or afterwards. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Teppo. That was very time considerate. Thanks so much. Christine?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Christine Moser. I am based in Amsterdam at VU University. Well, thank you for the invitation. Fantastic initiative, Joop. Very happy to be here. And well, this was a great talk already, Teppo, and I'm looking forward to the others too. And yeah, let me just share my screen and start right away. So in the past few years, I've been interested in thinking about AI more broadly in mostly in practice. Actually, that's how my journey here began, and looking at what how did the kind of the adoption on a large scale of predictive AI models that was first, how did that impact business, and then specifically, how do people actually work with it? And today's topic is, of course, about generative AI, and then mostly people mean with this large language models like ChatGPT, Claude, Microsoft Copilot we have now, and many others. And that's what I would like to share some thoughts about today. And I'm really curious about how you think about this. And please engage in the chat and ask questions. So first, I would like to point out two important boundary conditions to all AI models and also generative AI models. Firstly, many models, actually most and certainly the big ones, are produced and owned by for-profit multinationals. I think that's really an important thing to remember, because these are businesses with a profit motive, which is fine in and of itself, but as soon as for example, research, academic research, which is in principle not profit-oriented, or at least, let's say, ideally not. Not sure where we are heading in this country in the future, but it should not be. There's the first and foremost motive would be knowledge production, perhaps. So this means you would intermingle two very different goals of the companies providing tools and data and those using it. So just a boundary condition. And then the second boundary condition is that AI models are by design and by kind of almost natural law, I would say, biased. This is because whatever you put into a system is biased simply because all kinds of data we create are biased because they are done by humans, and humans are biased. So it's a kind of a very basic assumption, which is often however, forgotten, or even it's pretended that that we can figure out a way to make ethical AI or unbiased algorithms, which I can see how something can be unbiased if you by privileging one group above another, for example. That's an inherent bias. And obviously, algorithms are biased in the sense that an algorithm is built to produce one particular output and not another one. So that means it's biased by design. And obviously, this creates bias in output. And bias is here understood quite broadly. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's very important to remember that these kind of models, there's no grand truth that holds for the whole planet. So therefore, but this is something we need to remember. Because, of course, these models are not only produced and owned by multinationals, but also rolled out by these multinationals, usually globally. They are not localized, and therefore there's a pretense of being applicable across the globe, across time and space, and being unbiased. And just wanted to share that this is, in my opinion, not the case. So moving on to how does AI, or how could it, might it shape theorizing? So here, I would like to talk about a few things that I think influence how we as researchers might change our ways when working with big data, and also working with outputs of large language models. It's very important to be quite specific here because obviously not every use of AI leads to kind of theory risk in theory making or in theory creativity. So this does not apply to any use to all use of AI. Please don't misunderstand me here, but I think it's worthwhile to think about some of the basic assumptions that we entertain in management studies. So here we have identified two particular things that we might think might be under risk, might be at risk when working particularly with big data. And then, so I will first explain this model in a bit and then try and apply it to large language models and see what you think about it. So first of all, the basic theory here is that using big data and AI models, big data created by these AI models and also analyzed by them may lead to a lack of scientific validity. And secondly, we think that there's a performativity effect. So that means that the very technology we use can shape our theories and also shape the reality, so creating a feedback loop here. So this links a little bit to Teppo, to your presentation where you said that humans are in control, and we think maybe there is an interaction going on where if you are exposed to the output of the models, which you of course created in the first place, but if you're exposed for an extensive period, then the very social reality might change and accordingly. So this goes back to sociology of numbers, performativity of theories, and so on. And I think it does apply well to AI as well. So first of all, we think one problem that is being emphasized and scaled here by AI is scaling. By scaling, I mean that in research, we usually we try to simplify our theories, our constructs, our concepts to be able to compare, to contrast across contexts. So that's what's meant by scaling, right? So in science studies, you would look for scientific laws, for example, which apply to multiple phenomena. In our field, we would try to seek explanations which would be applicable to different contexts as well. However, here in AI, scaling is done at a really new scale. So really trying to flatten out the entire data set. So pretty much ignoring background, history, time, space, context, and so on. So there's a lot of detail in the data. And that obviously means that whatever you output from that data might be flawed too. Secondly, so the scaling then may lead to the scaling allows for in big data analysis for proxies to be scaled as well. And proxies, with this, I mean kind of atheoretical choices, things that stand in for something you cannot measure. So in science, we usually we speak, for example, about latent constructs or about unobserved variables, which we can still try and approximate. So this is where the proxy comes from, by looking at researching things that might hint towards this latent variable. But the difference here is with proxies, there's no theorization going on. So very often there's no reason to assume a theoretical underlying connection between two measures, or between the thing you want to measure and the thing you can measure. But mostly it's simply a convenience choice, right? So one pretty evident example is that very often banks, when they judge people on their capacity to receive a loan, they take the postal code as a proxy for income. Obviously, postal code and income are in some ways related, but they're certainly not foolproof. And there's no theory really that makes the banks use this proxy. It's simply that they saw a correlation in the data. And this is how it very often goes. With these, with the new AI models, they're so powerful that they can extract all these correlations and observations. And then kind of they are being swapped for proof, but without the theory, right? So what we see is the very empirics-driven research, just as Teppo also described just now. There's no need anymore for theories, because we can show you here the significant correlations or whatever they find in the data however, without being able to explain what that actually means, and that's problematic. So all of this goes then into algorithmic decision-making, which comes with its own problem, of course. So here we kind of mix up the scale data, the proxies, which measure something we are not actually sure what it measures. And then it gets crunched in a model that has been created with a particular design in mind, very often in some way with a profit motive, not always, but given that it's multinationals, that's not a crazy thing. And then we output it, and here the argument is if we then try and create theories based on these kind of data, based on these kinds of measures, that there is at least the risk that our validity is under threat. And that's because what we are doing is, first of all, decoupling kind of the explanation from the phenomenon. So if data are created without a specific goal in mind, for example, so using a proxy without a good reason to, how can we then couple a reason for using this data and an explanation for the phenomenon? And secondly, of course, another problem here with scientific validity is that usually the multinationals do not disclose what kind of data goes into the model, and neither do they disclose the particular algorithm. I know there's some change going on, but being unable as a researcher to be transparent about the entire research process is problematic. And of course, this algorithmic decision-making also feeds into the performativity of the technology. One simple reason is that the output of AI models, and very specifically also Gen AI models, is just super convincing. It's really, it looks great. So why would you doubt it? So in this way, it kind of changes first of all, our distance with the model itself, with the output. But also, as I said before, it can influence the very thing we are studying, right? So let's say we study scientists. Scientists suddenly work a lot with AI. So how can we be sure? It's almost like a synthetic world which we are studying. Never quite sure what the actual human is and where the synthetic comes in and where they are intertwined. So, and just to finish up, I think that all of these points are applicable to generative AI, just as they are to broader understandings of AI. For the scaling, I think it's quite obvious that large language models, they don't discriminate where data comes from. It's just textual data as input, and we don't know where it comes from many models, most models. But they also don't tell us what kind of origin is it, what was the context where data come from. So some of these weird outputs are there for this very reason, that the model does not discriminate between where does it come from, some 4chan forum or a newspaper article. And secondly, the proxies, I think there as well, simply because the way that large language models work focuses on the form of the language and not the substance, right? This is where this lack of, as you also said, Teppo, the lack of human maybe creativity and futurizing kicks in. The model can measure the form, it can sort the words and make them look pretty. However, it cannot it's atheoretical in that sense. It cannot make the meaningful connections, at least not yet. Let's see what the others are saying. Algorithmic decision-making, of course, is at play here. And I believe that the hallucinations are one output that is not meant to be. As I'm aware, the makers of these models were quite... They knew this was happening. They nevertheless persisted in rolling out the models across the globe. But so algorithmic decision-making with all its flaws is going on in generative AI models as well. And hence, these risks would be in place for using the models, the large language models, for theorizing in management studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. You actually finished early. Okay, so that was our expert panel discussing LLMs and large language models. Now we're going to move to three other panel members who are journal editors. And to kick us off will be Eva from Organization Theory. Eva, over to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, hello, everybody. I'm happy to be invited to this panel and to open the discussion on the journal's perspective on this. My name is Eva Boxenbaum, and I'm Associate Editor for Organization Theory, and I am also a professor at Copenhagen Business School. And I'm also past division chair for the OMT division of AUM. And I'm saying that not just to put out titles there, but to say that I'm quite invested in the profession, in our profession, and what this development means for the profession, also more broadly beyond journals. So I would like to share some perspectives with you. Let me see if I can get into the presentation here. Wonderful. Okay, so the first thing I want to share is just to let you know about this editorial that we wrote in Organization Theory under the leadership of Jeppe Cornelissen and Markus Höllerer, who are our co-editors-in-chief, to elaborate on what large language models can do for theorizing and the policy that Organization Theory has set out. I don't want to go through this presentation or through that article, but I want you to have a look at it if you're interested in this area, because it's very nicely developed. Well, if I'm allowed to say that about work that I contributed to, but to elaborate on how AI can be useful for theorizing and also some of the pitfalls. What I want to spend this little bit of time we have together today on is to look more carefully at the broader perspective on what does this mean for our profession. And one of the first questions that we had for this panel is, what is it that we can use generative AI for? And I think, just as Christine also emphasized, that there's something here about what is it that we access when we go into the knowledge that is accessible through large language models. And I would like to emphasize here that it reproduces our socially constructed world. And what I mean by that is that we should not equate what we find there with the social world out there. It's not one-to-one. And I think that's part of the mistakes that are sometimes made when people go through and use just for empirical research to see what can we find of knowledge about our world through AI tools. It's not a one-to-one. It's socially constructed, but it's not socially constructed in one-on-one. What we see in there, what we can find, is verbal articulations that are appearing digitally in writing. And so there's a number of things that are not captured here. There are things that we may speak about, but that have not been written out. There are things that are written in books, but not available digitally. We're not having the same kind of representation of the history of knowledge, because it's the digitally available knowledge that we access when we use AI and large language models. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we think about what is it as a knowledge product that we can develop when we use these tools, and what are we not capturing? What is not being articulated here, or what is being over-articulated? I think we're not discussing that enough. What are the things that appear far too often in verbal articulations, and what are not being said, but are also part of the world out there? And the same goes for visual depictions. I think they're even worse, actually, when we start to use AI also for visual reproduction and videos that are able to be produced now. That is a certain body of knowledge that we're accessing there. And for me, it was the biggest eye-opener of how it's not a representation of the world that we encounter in real life. Is if you ask something about generating an image of females, and the image that generates is like closer to some kind of fantasy imagination of a female than what is statistically represented of females. And I think these things are important to keep in mind as we start to do research with these tools, that we are capturing maybe more things that are scary, more things that are attractive, that are dreamy, more things that people verbally articulate, and we capture less of the things that people do not put into words, or that are too ordinary or taken for granted. and we may not be able to capture those. And I think we need to take that into consideration as we start to use these tools. But that we're accessing that knowledge, that is something that we can do, and that is interesting to do with these tools, and that we will have to do. Whether we are interested in it or not, I'm sure we will all be encouraged to do that and be asked to use AI tools to access it. There's also some opportunities with AI, I think, for generating ideas. It's not the full scope of possible ideas that we can generate in there, but of course, there's a basis of knowledge in there. We can combine things. They can make plausible combinations for us. These are not combinations that are necessarily true, or, you know, just as we can see if we ask it to generate references for us, it creates plausible references for what a particular scholar could have written, but it rarely, at least until now, captures a real reference. But these plausible combinations are also useful. They can help us generate ideas or come up with, to try and explore what is already available out there. And it produces some kind of combinatory elements that is limited, of course, to what knowledge is available out there in the AI accessible world, and also to the realm of our imagination, because we have to use prompts to access it. So what, you know, there's more and more focus being put into which prompts do we use. And there is something very creative, or we show our creativity through the prompts, not through the answers that we get when we put it into the system. And so I think this, you know, we have to be, it is also an opportunity for us to think more about our own imagination and the limits to that imagination. But these things, accessing knowledge and generating some ideas, playing around with what's out there, this is useful and we can use it, I believe. I've heard also that it's equivalent, it helps us to have an AI assistance in many ways, but not more than if we had 4 or 5 different people assembled who have different sources of knowledge. So it's not magic either. Some people, maybe not in our field, but some people are overly enthusiastic about what AI can do. I don't think we want to go there. It's not that we're going to be replaced and AI is going to do everything that we can do, but it's also not that it can do nothing for us. So I think we have to stay out of the extremes of dismissing it or fearing it too much, but also stay out of the risk of being overly enthusiastic about everything it can do, and try to collectively figure out what can it do well for us? What kind of assistance can it offer us as researchers? So that's the first element. Then there is a second element of how should we anticipate and prepare for its increasing use? What should we do as not only as individuals, but also as a profession, as a journal, as universities? What are the kind of things we could and should do? And I think using it as a research support tool seems to be the absolute obvious. We have to do that. We do get AI assistance already. The world is embracing these tools. We need to also be able to do that. If we don't, then we risk as a profession being seen as a bit old-fashioned and not on the frontier of knowledge and technology, and which is not particularly attractive for our profession to be slotted there. So we absolutely do need to embrace it. And what can it then be used for? That's I think, a collective discussion in our field. But here are some ideas for what I think we can use it for. Develop state-of-the-art. We do a lot of that work when we do research. It can help us there to develop state-of-the-art. It can produce some pretty good representations of knowledge that is already out there. It may not be perfect. We need to help it. We may need to change the categories, do various things with it, but at least it can assist us in accessing and developing the state-of-the-art. It can also be useful for us for generating plausible ideas, to play around with ideas, to see what's out there in the socially constructed world that we have access to. None of us have access to as much as we can get using AI. So there might be things there that we can identify. Maybe there are literatures we didn't know about, or different professions focusing on certain things that we were not aware of. So it can, expand our horizon, give us some ideas, not facts, not theories, but some ideas that we can put into our own judgment and work. I think it also has some opportunities for us to communicate professionally for multiple audiences. It can, if we put something in that is very scientific and technical and aimed at our own academic audience, it can translate that for a different audience. And that can be useful for us to be able to use these tools to communicate the knowledge we generate to more and different types of groups. So for impact purposes, for instance, instead of us writing one great article that is theoretically well-founded and then writing other articles for professional communication to applied journals, for instance, it may be able to help us transmit that very high-level knowledge that we generate, and where it may not be so good at doing that for us, but we still need our own skills. And I mean, I think we should not outsource everything to AI. We need to absolutely keep some things for us. And what I would really like us to think about is what it is that it can do for us. What are the things that we do when we do research and we generate objectively new knowledge at the frontier of our field? I don't believe it can do that for us. So what is it that we do aside from mobilizing existing knowledge and generating ideas? There's something about our judgment and the contextual knowledge, the contextual application of knowledge. So not the very abstract big lines, but knowledge in a particular context. AI is not so great at doing that. So we have some opportunities there to think about what is it that we know, and maybe spend some time discussing and thinking about it. What is it that we're able to do when we contextualize knowledge to a particular area or area of research or practical context? This kind of judgment is not easily outsourceable. There's also a lot of embodied knowledge and that we have, and that it doesn't have in the same way. And this is why I want also to have that. I would like our profession to also discuss the human resource aspects of this. How do we retain people in our profession? How do we use these tools to assist excellent researchers so that we keep human resources? I think there is a big risk for us with all this disruption going on that young people will be lured by other types of professions, and we want to absolutely keep the excellent human resources that we have right now in our profession. And I think we should give some thought to that. What is it that is attractive, and how can we build on that? What to stimulate ourselves and not end up being, bored or feeling like we are machines? But what is it that we like in this profession? What is attractive about it? And how can we make sure to keep that and then use AI to assist it, not replace it? And the same, I think, goes for social inclusion. There's a lot of discussion right now about the risks also of AI being used for exclusion purposes. Not necessarily deliberately, but just out of the way things go when you use knowledge that is already out there. You could keep selecting the same types of profiles because obviously these profiles or this knowledge or this approach has been used so many times, and you can end up reinforcing the institutional structures that are already there. And that may actually lead to more exclusion and more reproduction of the type of knowledge we have already, of the type of profiles we have in research, and end up excluding people. And I really think that it's important that we keep that in mind, and that we build in to our future how to foster social inclusion, This is something that means a lot to organization theory as a journal as well. How do we get different ideas? How do we get novel ideas? How do we get the things that are not necessarily mainstream or well established into the knowledge production? And I think we should start theorizing some of these things and think about how we can do that so that we end up and keep a profession that is really vibrant and exciting. And I know that the EU has developed some legislation around AI that is aimed specifically at preventing discrimination. And I believe very much that we should keep that in mind as well for our field as we use more and more of these tools. Imagine for the large conferences like Academy of Management, if we start having people submit papers that are written by AI or review papers that are submitted, we will reinforce some of the same tendencies that are already there, some of the way of formulating ourselves, and we will shield ourselves off from novel ideas that a human would recognize as, oh, that's exciting, that's new, that's different, but a machine may not do in the same way. And then finally, this question of what should we as editors, learned societies, and other stakeholders do to ensure that this technology benefits our scholarly community. And that is this main topic of what are the essential research skills that cannot be outsourced. We need absolutely, from my perspective, to start articulating these things, thinking about it, theorizing it upfront. We can do that in parallel with learning the technologies of AI tools, but we absolutely need to do this for our profession, to think about what it is that we cannot and should not outsource to AI, so that we can keep our profession in the position it is of being leading new thoughts, of driving innovation, of coming up with new ways of seeing the world, and not just doing what other people could do with AI tools to reproduce what we know already. And I think we should articulate these essential research skills and start training students and early career scholars in these skills right away, like not wait for it. We need to do this now so that we can keep those skills. It may not be to write a good lit review, because that is not going to be an essential research skill, but then there is something about how do we generate new knowledge? What is it that are these creative leaps that I think it was also Anne Langley who Teppo mentioned already, came up with. How do we keep these types of essential skills, and what are they? How do we keep the embodied part of the pursuit of knowledge, the excitement, the collaboration with around a profession and around an area of research? We definitely need to do that. We also need to develop some quality assurance systems. And I know journals, we have an important role to play there. We need to play that role in collaboration with the Academy of Management and other learned societies, in collaboration with universities that also need to play a role in quality assurance and in promotions of researchers. And and what I think one of the institutions that are really important for us as researchers is peer review. Peer review cannot be replaced. It can be assisted, but it can't be fully replaced. So how do we apply these quality assurance systems in peer review in journals, conferences, PhD defenses, and start articulating and building a strong, firm basis, similar to what we have already, but just thinking about emphasizing more the essential skills for knowledge production that cannot readily be outsourced. And as I said, I think contextual knowledge, embodied knowledge, judgment, these are things that are much harder. And then, of course, develop some rewards for these skills. And we have lots of creativity, lots of imagination, lots of knowledge. It should be possible for us to engage in developing some of these things to protect our profession and keep attracting the excellent people into it that we have right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eva. That was really helpful. Okay, so next we have Matthew, who is an editor of Academic Management Journal. Matthew, over to you.
Thanks. Eva, you mind stop sharing your slides? Okay, perfect, thanks. Okay. All right, so I think it's going to become fairly obvious to everyone that I'm going to be the most positive and most bullish on AI's possibilities for augmenting and automating much of what we do. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think this is going to change the nature of what we do in the next decade. I like this quote, "May you live in interesting times." It's often attributed, it's often seen as a Chinese adage that's, it seems to be a blessing, but in reality, it's actually a curse. So next time you see one of your frenemies, you can wish them, may you live in interesting times, and they'll think you're blessing them, but you're actually cursing them. I think this is, we're clearly living in interesting times. The role of AI is causing a huge commotion across a lot of different professions, including our own. And I think that we're going to have to work through this year after year and decade after decade as the capabilities continue to emerge. The other interesting thing about this quote is that the source is often it's in contention. So even though we think of it as being a Chinese adage, actually some have disputed that. And so again, this speaks to some of what we've wrestled with respect to the capabilities of AI, both struggling with context and struggling with sourcing. Some of you might be familiar with Amara's law. This basically is the law that, regarding the impact of technological changes, we tend to overestimate in the short term, and then we underestimate in the long term. Generally speaking, the problem here is with human tendency to think linearly and a failure to think exponentially. And there's a lot of exponentials that we're living through right now, both in terms of the the computational power, the size of these large language models, beyond the data that it's being trained on, right? It's the number of people using it and providing reinforcement and training to those models. And feedback. So there's a lot of exponentials here. And my general sense is that we're living somewhere on this curve right now, in between overestimation and underestimation. And so I think you'll probably see a bit of that within our field, right? Some people overestimating, some people underestimating. I probably sit somewhere in between Kahneman and some of my other fellow members of the panel. In this respect, but I also think that a lot of this has to do with building out the use cases. So right now we're seeing generative AI through the lens of these kind of chat interfaces, and so these interfaces are evolving, and the possibilities of new interfaces and training is consistently advancing. So training around using this for quantitative data analysis or even for qualitative data collection and analysis. The recent editorial that we published back about 6 months ago in AMJ has been downloaded 12,000 times in the last 6 months. I think this speaks to, the hunger to understand this technology, but also I think in some ways the fears of what this might mean in terms of what it's going to do to our profession. In that editorial, we sort of break down knowledge production into its constituent parts: synthesis, development, evaluation, and translation. I'll just briefly review some of where I see a lot of the advances in AI helping and assisting, augmenting, and potentially automating a lot of what we do in this knowledge production. So from a synthesis perspective, some of you might be familiar with tools like Consensus, which do this at a very large generic level. But you've probably seen very mixed kinds of outputs for those of you who have used these tools to perform literature reviews. Lynn Jewell, who's a PhD student at Imperial, has recently created a tool on Discord. You can download it on GitHub. This is a tool that actually begins to sort of take management knowledge, management scholarship, and it creates a knowledge base with that management scholarship, allowing you to then create literature reviews using the knowledge base that you might have developed. So again, it's a more narrow knowledge base that will help with things like hallucinations, et cetera. From a knowledge development perspective, I mean, this is where I think we've seen massive strides over the last year. From a data collection standpoint, whether it's about scraping large data sets off the web, or in terms of automating the data collection process through interviews on WhatsApp, right? So a lot of times qualitative researchers will have studies with 40 or 60 interviews in a really larger data set. Imagine a world in which people can automate the collection of 1,000 interviews over WhatsApp with hard to reach individuals in indigenous communities who only have access to WhatsApp for communication, right? So and then translate those interviews for you, right? So the ability to scale the qualitative data collection process is growing immeasurably. From a data analysis standpoint, obviously machine learning and its capabilities, we've talked long about that. From a theorizing perspective, and I'll have to contend with some of my fellow panelists on this point, in the sense that I think it's actually quite good at specifically dealing with counterfactuals and coming up with things that so actually an interesting aside here. So Teppo has this great tool called the Value Lab, which if you haven't downloaded it, it's a really interesting tool. It's very useful for engaging with students. I actually use it with a lot of executives and in trying to push them to think counterfactually. One of the things that's very hard is getting people to think about, coming up with ideas that few other people around them believe to be true. And this, I've actually built a GPT AI bot that I deploy to the students to actually push them to think counterfactually, much more so than they were capable of prior to using the tool. So the ability to theorize, to come up with new things. I mean, this has been something that let's see here. Fanish Purnam and several of his colleagues in org science back in 2020 were talking about the power of algorithms to help with theorizing. And I think that those advances from 2020 to now have only improved its ability to help with theoretical hypothesizing, augmentation, and even coming up with really counterfactual or unobvious kinds of research questions and hypotheses. Moving on to knowledge evaluation. This is a really tricky one, as several of my fellow panelists have mentioned, because obviously, I mean, the peer review process is something that we use to control the integrity of what we do, but it's also what we use as gatekeeping. So it's been very important in sort of establishing status in the field and controlling knowledge production. But obviously, one of the things we're worried about here is false positives and false negatives, right? And so the question is, can artificial intelligence, generative AI, help us with knowledge evaluation? Well, for the same reason I think that it can help with knowledge synthesis and critique for authorship purposes, I think it can probably help with review purposes. Certainly on the reviewer selection side, we all recognize, I think, that the review process is noisy, right? That there are a lot of false positives and false negatives in the review process. So the question is, can AI help reduce the number of false positives and false negatives? I think the answer is probably yes. Now, the question is, should we outsource it, right? So I think it can augment and automate a lot of these things, but then there are these questions of what should we outsource, and this will be something I'll come back to. From a knowledge translation perspective, obviously the ability to take what we've done and translate it to from a theory practice perspective, from a language perspective, this is an obvious use case. Obviously, there are a lot of risks, and I think a number of my fellow panelists have mentioned some of these and others. Ranging from bias to systems transparency, the fact that a lot of the algorithms are black boxed, to the relevant and accurate sourcing, to hallucinations, to the ability for people to misuse these tools in ways. We already know that there are ethical challenges in our field. The power of these tools only accentuates and increases the incentives to engage in these kinds of deviant activities. And also there are risks of false negatives and positives during evaluation. Now, these are the kinds of risks that I generally think that we are going to make strides in with these technologies over the coming years. In bold, the deep research fakes one is going to be very hard to deal with. I'm not sure how we're going to deal with this as a field, but a lot of these papers that you'll see here on the screen deal with exactly how we're already building out tools to help with this. I'll only touch on this one, the historical bias conformity one, because this is one that I think a lot of us get tripped up on, which is the idea that it's that the bias is based primarily in all of the training data. So if you have this historically biased training data, then you're only going to be able to produce historically biased content on the back end. And the idea there being that these tools are regurgitative, right? So it sees what it or recombinative, but it's actually these tools are based in transformers. So they're taking so it's not just the training data, but also the rewards that are coupled together with that. So again, you can orient these tools towards more exploratory purposes or more conforming purposes. So if you have historical biases in that, you can push these tools to actually move in positively deviant ways away from those historical biases, right? So and the ability, I recognize one of the points that Christine was making about that bias is inherent, right? It's impossible to escape bias, right? Anytime you're designing these systems, you're inserting bias. It can be good or it can be bad, and I think in some ways, you can combine these tools to help, or you can combine models to help you deal with some of this. You can sort of balance things, so you can have a more exploratory model, a more conforming model, right? You can, and then that can help you to wrestle with some of these things. One other risk point here, which is, I'm actually sort of stealing this from Purnam, who gave a wonderful talk at King's College London a few weeks ago on the state of using generative AI in research. And I mean, one of the things he mentions is the risk of novice temptation. So I think as we're training PhD students and people who are unexposed to a particular field, right, there's a huge temptation at these earliest stages to embrace these tools to kind of leapfrog the long journey of developing skills and knowledge and expertise. And so there's, I think that is a really big field risk, and it's also a big individual risk that we have to think about. And I'm not entirely clear how to deal with that. There's, I think there's a lot of big questions that are raised by all of this. Like, so if you buy into my arguments that a lot of what we already do can be either augmented or eventually automated through these tools, then the question is, what should be our position on that? And I think a lot of that has to do with how you understand what it is that we're doing. So is what we're doing producing knowledge, in which case we want more quality and more quantity. We want to optimize on the quality and quantity. Or is what we're doing craft, right? I mean, and are we trying to protect that craft and defend the profession? And so, and I think that this will result in lots of different policies and monitoring. I mean, Chris will talk a little bit about JMS's policies. I'm sort of alluding to a bit of what he'll probably be discussing here. But I'll just end on this last point, which is I think what we need the most right now is training. I think that the lack of awareness and understanding of what these tools are, how to use them ethically and responsibly, is enormous right now. And so the building out training programs, not just for PhD students, but for junior faculty, for senior faculty, for anybody who's doing research right now, I think is really important. And for reviewers, for journal editors, we're going to be hitting up against these issues more and more over the next year. So I'll leave it there and stop sharing.
Thank you, Matthew. And last but not least of our panel speakers who is representing the editor of Journal of Management Studies. Christopher, over to you.
Right. All right. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ebert. Thank you for organizing, and thanks for the other speakers that have been talking ahead of me. I'll try to be brief, also in order to not be redundant to what we have heard before, because my ideas about AI are quite consistent with what we've heard before, and the way I see it, the position of JMS is relatively coherent, or if not quite overlapping with the position of OT and also with AMJ before. Thanks for putting the policy on your slide already, Matthew. So let's just recapitulate the essence of what JMS's position on AI is. So first, it's important, and I think we have touched both in the conversation right now already. There are two things when it comes to AI and research. So there is research on AI as a phenomenon, and there's research with AI as a tool. At JMS, we try to have something to say on both of these aspects. We currently have an editorial in the making about research on AI as a phenomenon. So we believe that this certainly warrants quite a few very interesting research opportunities, both on the bright and on the dark side of it. But now let me focus on research with AI as a tool. So similar to the other journals, we believe at JMS that we need to offer authors a little bit of guidance because it's a high velocity field. It's developing rapidly. New AI tools are just popping up like mushrooms, basically. And our sense was specifically junior or early career scholars, but basically anyone in our community needs some guidance on what is adequate and what not. How should we use AI as a tool in the research process? Of course, if you make such a statement, that opens the floor to critique, and we are aware that we will need to revisit our policy on a rolling basis, as much as the conversation about it develops and as the whole technology develops. And we have seen this already from the other speakers. So this is how we see it at the moment, but it's very likely that we're going to revisit that on a yearly basis. So I don't want to go into too much detail. You can access the policy open access on our website. And we wrote a little editorial similar to OT and AMJ around it, basically to motivate the policy, to explain it in detail, and to justify our decisions there a little bit. What is the essence of it is that authors who submit their work to JMS can use AI. So we do allow that, but we do expect full disclosure of every aspect of it in the paper. So I think that is important. So it's not something that we see should be restricted to the cover letter to the editor, so only the editor would know. But we want that everyone who reads the paper, which at first is going to be the reviewers, and then any kind of reader, should the paper be accepted, should know. Because we think this creates transparency. This kind of forces the authors to justify why their use of AI or a particular aspect of AI for a particular aspect of the research process was adequate and useful. So we expect some sort of reflection that is evoked through this. And that could, for example, be done in a method section where you commonly have data analysis, data collection, and so on. There could be a novel section on use of AI in the manuscript if it relates to the research method. Right, so that's important. And what we then do in the remainder of the editorial, and Matthew showed an example of that, we do want to alert scholars that using AI can both augment and harm research quality. And we do expect authors to take full responsibility and accountability for that. So if the AI makes a mistake, it's ultimately their own fault, because they are the authors of the paper. and then we go through various steps of the research process, and we give our take on what could be augmentation of research quality and what can be harm for research quality. At JMS, we do not allow reviewers and editors to use AI in any form. There are various reasons for this. One is confidentiality. So whenever you use AI, you feed confidential information, namely a submitted manuscript that is in the review process, is not public, into the cloud, basically, so it's not public anymore. So there's a confidentiality breach, and we see this as a key reason why we don't want reviewers to use it. Another point is that when we ask reviewers to evaluate a manuscript, we do ask for the expertise and ability of judgment of a particular person to review a paper. If the reviewer would use AI, we could just feed it into AI directly ourselves. We wouldn't need a reviewer in the first place, and the same goes for editors. We do believe that we are able to provide a good judgment on a paper, otherwise we probably wouldn't be editors. So there's not really a point in having that fed into AI. But then again, also the confidentiality argument is a key reason. So you've seen an excerpt of this table. I will not go into each and every detail, but what we basically did is we go through a range of practices of AI used in research, which starts with editing, formatting, and typesetting. So they're relatively mundane, low-level things. But also, and we've heard a little bit of this, literature review tools where AI can augment and harm. Using it as an analytical tool in qualitative and quantitative research, idea and content generation, reviewing and editing. We list a few current examples. Current is important because that's at the time of writing, and probably by now there will be new tools. In 5 years, there will probably be many tools. And then kind of concluding from the augmentation and harm position that we have, we refer to our concrete policy there. What are some challenges for journal editors and reviewers in this fast-moving environment? I think it's also important to make the authors aware of it, how we see that as editors of a journal. So my view is that at present, so that could be totally different in a few years. At present, a fully or partly AI-generated manuscripts is relatively easy to detect because it's simply very poor in quality. So I see a lot of manuscripts. I haven't seen one where the authors openly acknowledge they used AI and it was in fact a good paper. Maybe there are these things, but I haven't seen it. But as I said, we expect this to change over the course of 2 to 5 years and longer. What is a problem for us as editors or gatekeepers at a journal is that reliable AI scanners and plagiarist software are not really available, or well, they're not reliable. They are available, but not reliable. And we have heard about false positives already earlier. So that is an issue to detect it. What's also an issue for us, and we see this specifically at JMS, I would not be surprised if other journals experience the same. We're simply drowned in masses of AI-generated submissions. So we currently have 2,000, and many of which are very poor in quality, but still we need to process these professionally, which means higher workload for editors, which means in consequence less time for real papers where authors did some serious thinking behind the research. We do have countermeasures in place, which are beyond the scanners I talked about. So we currently, or we continuously developing criteria where we can basically sort out papers which are very low in quality and have a high likelihood of being partly or fully AI generated. The problem is that we need to kind of talk about trust with regard to our authors, or well, trusting each other in the communities. Authors need to trust editors, we need to trust authors. reviewers need to trust authors, and so on. So that's the whole issue of trusting that authors actually disclose the use of AI as our policy demands it is potentially becoming a more prominent issue. So we heard about the downsides, but also some upsides of AI, and this is just a very recent paper. And the latest one I came across, where the authors argued ChatGPT is bullshit, and unfold that argument. But let me not go into detail. My general sense here is whenever authors use AI, it's really important to be aware of the aspects where it could augment research quality and where it could harm research quality. So the problem from JMS point of view, as we speak, the vast majority of AI generated papers end up being admin or desk rejected anyway. The thing is that, and this is maybe my personal take, that in our very much, or if not entirely, theory-driven field cases where I clearly augmented the quality of research output. What do I mean with quality? A more interesting, more novel and original paper with more groundbreaking insights that would challenge conventional wisdom remains sparse, if not entirely absent. But this can, of course, change, right? So for generating truly novel and insightful theory, we're not there yet, if we even want to be there. But at the same time, I think for more technical aspects such as language editing, various forms of data crunching, and this can be qualitative and quantitative reference lists, and so the logistics of a paper, so to say, it can be quite useful. So I think for specifically for early career scholars, it's very important to acknowledge that AI can be good for some things, but not for all, and it needs to be used with care. That was my talk. So, Wickert, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I mean, this was very rich and very broad range of perspectives that each of you introduced in this conversation. And I'm very keen to open it up to the audience because I've seen lots of questions in the chat function, lots of comments, interesting. So very keen to open it up to Q&A. Just a couple of things in terms of the Q&A, because we have 5 panel members, how we're going to go about it is, first of all, I invite all of those of you who commented or asked questions in the chat, please bring them out, so to speak, from the chat into the open here. Please turn your video on and turn your microphone on, and so we can see you and hear, ask a question. When you ask a question, please raise your hand so we can see you. And the second thing is you can either ask a specific panelist your question, or you can direct your question to all the panelist members, and one or more of them will respond. So let's open it up, and perhaps I could start with the first question. And a number of the panelists alluded to junior scholars using Gen AI, and my hunch is that this is probably the audience that is most likely to take up on the offer, so to speak, of using Gen AI for research purposes. It might be evident to people why to use Gen AI for their research, but maybe we could talk a little bit more about, what might be the downsides, particularly how it might affect, our development as scholars in the way we theorize, in the way we collect data, the way we analyze data, and the way we publish. This is just an open question to all the panelist members here.
Can I say something on that?
Please.
You're asking about the downside. I mean, imagine you taught a PhD student just with Wikipedia articles. Like that was the only source, right? And so that's sort of the metaphor I think that might be useful here. You'd learn lots of things, and you can get tremendous breadth in terms of lots of different areas. But no expert in a given area would learn something from a Wikipedia article in their specific domain, right? This has been my experience. Like I use these tools constantly, Claude, GPT, and pay for all the different services and so forth. But at the very forefront of what you're doing, I would suspect that you're not learning something that's new. And so I'd be cautious on those terms. I think that there's lots of other ways that you can learn and use it, but I would just be cautious in terms of kind of at the very forefront of knowledge. In the end, you're dealing with a stochastic sort of statistical word engine that is parroting back to you things that are in its training data, which is great. And it's remarkable because the training data is huge, right? And there's all kinds of other models, mixture of experts models, all kinds of other models that are trying to sort of, retrieval augmented models, et cetera, RAGs and so forth, right? So they're trying to sort of architect around this universality to get to specifics. And I think maybe we'll get to those places, but I think the caution is that don't take the outputs or those conversations, interactions as the forefront. This is sort of, it's a stochastic word engine, and it's important to keep that in mind, even though it's exciting. Like I said, I have these things constantly running myself, and so yeah.
Thank you, Teppo. Okay, unless there's any other panel members who want to respond to that question, I can see the 3 hands up at the moment. Tatiana, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. I would have a question maybe for Christopher, because he referred to it, but if any other panelists would like to address it, it's very welcome. So I was thinking, what would be, or the question is, what would be the impact on the ethical norms, what we currently define as being ethical, if we start using it? Because I have the feeling that we should reconsider that. And if so, how should we do it in the future in terms of research? Yeah, so if we think about plagiarism and the way how we define what is ethical, what is not, what would be the definition of ethicality in the context of using AI, generative AI?
Well, that's a good question. So we try to be straightforward in our policy, and we try to give our authors as clearly as possible guidance of what we think, what they can do and what not. I think what is the ethical use of AI is an ongoing discussion, but I don't think it is entirely distinct from the discussion about ethics in the research process that we had before the use of AI. So, and there can be very, like, if you use AI as a tool in the process, and I'm not talking about having an entire paper generated by AI. I mean, that exists, right? And we need to deal with that, and this is highly unethical. At the same time, for example, if you want concrete examples, I don't see it as a problem if an AI checks your reference list. If you use AI to find errors in your statistical analysis. If you use AI to translate transcriptions of interviews, and things like this, where it's still clear that the idea, and I believe this is going to be a better idea, is generated by the author, but if AI is a support tool, I don't see this as a problem. I think but we need to have a conversation about this, and we need to have we need to observe the field and how it develops, and then we need to engage we need to deliberate basically, and find a consensus as a scholarly community of what we consider ethical or not. I mean, who are we as editors to tell everyone what's ethical and not? We can only join the conversation about this, and that's why we think transparency about it to the readers and the reviewers is important. So this over time, this will contribute to a sense of, okay, what is actually a use of AI which is ethical and clearly augments the overall quality of the research. But I cannot give you an ultimate answer for this. Maybe the others, maybe if I can.
Yeah. Well, I would like to suggest that we pay more attention to what is the AI work and what is the researcher's work. Right now, we're focusing very much on figuring out what AI can do for us and what we can outsource and how we can do it efficiently. And that is great. And we need to do that. But once we have developed those tools, it's also very important that we say, what is ours? Where do we keep our individual responsibility as researcher? What is not something we can blame on an algorithm or on the knowledge available out there, but that is ours? And I think that's one of my main things is the next step. Once we have the technological things, what is key to us as researchers? What cannot be replaced? What should not be replaced? What is ethically our responsibility to ensure? And I think we need to focus on that. And I think it is journal editors' responsibility there. I think that is what peer review will do for us in the future, to be able to assess and validate those areas that we consider key and key to researchers. I think we should keep in mind that if we don't have anything that is key to the researcher, can't anybody do research? Like, you need to have a PhD to do research. Can't anybody who's like fabulously great at using AI produce knowledge at least as well as anybody with a PhD? And
But why would that be a bad thing?
What's that?
Why would that be a bad thing?
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but for our profession, I think it is very important. If we care about keeping our profession, a lot of, I work for a public university, it's financed by taxpayers to, of course, to do education of next generation, but also research. Are we willing to abolish that and say, well, whoever wants to pay for research can pay for research? Maybe companies will do so. They may have an interest in hiring people to do research that is convenient and useful for them and for their products. I think we need to protect something in our profession and think carefully about it while learning all these technological aspects of it. But it's not minor from my perspective, and it involves the ethical part as well.
I like the identity point there. I gave several LLMs a review to do. So SMJ sent me a paper, and I thought, I don't have time. I'm just going to have, the large language model do it for me, right? And so I generated lots of reviews. I looked through the reviews. You can even sort of do a meta thing where you take all the reviews, you give it to the different LLMs, have them review the review. How good is this? What should you add? What I got out of that was actually nothing that had sort of my stamp on it and nothing that had my voice on it. Like, there was no identity. Like, the reason why Rashri from SMJ sends it to me is because I do a certain type of research, right? And and so I have a point of view about things, and it could be biased, it could be problematic, whatever. But it is what it is, right? And so I think that identity point is really important. And what you have is this sort of averaging of identities, essentially with pulling together stochastically all these words. Again, it could be useful. It brought up interesting points and so forth. But actually, in the end, I used none of it, just because it didn't. And I think that beyond sort of the ethical, think about yourself as authors. If these tools are easy to use, everybody will be using them, fine. But what's your point of view about the world? What's your theory? What are you contributing? How's that at the forefront? How's that different? And so forth. And I think that's where the opportunities lie. Again, very excited about these tools, using lots of them and so forth. But I think at the forefront, that's critical. So.
But if you want the mean, it can give you the mean. If you want the outlier, it can give you the outlier. So in other words, if you want it to play a role, it can play the role, right? We could train a reviewer, a reviewing AI on all of your reviews, right? And produce a Teppo Felin review bot.
Yeah, I played with that too. I've created sort of, specific chat bots where I said, here's all the, here's 70, 80 papers, go through all of these. This is the voice and so forth. But it's, I don't know, these tools will get better. And so I'm actually excited about these tools. And so we'll see where it lands. But, where we are currently is all I can assess. And I think that, what our sort of identities are and what our point of view is, I think is critical. But yeah, I grant that there's sort of these kind of retrieval specific mechanisms where you go to specific data, as in somebody's research, for example. You could upload a person specific GPT with that. So anyway.
I think you're underestimating what you contribute. It's not just a point of view. It's not just Teppo's review machine. I think we should, care. We generate knowledge that we believe is generally useful in society. We have a very strong ethical mandate to our profession of developing knowledge that we truly believe approximates truth in one way or another, knowing that it's socially constructed and so forth, but we're committed to that quest. And not every actor out there is committed to this quest. And I think that ethical part of all of our identities and the judgment calls from experience and the ability to develop knowledge in students and in young early career researchers, I think we should not underestimate that part. And I don't think we can rely on AI and private actors to replace it.
I'll just add one more point. I mean, if you think about what an LLM's mechanism for establishing truth is, it's the number of times that a set of words have been said together, right? And so if a number of times people have talked about a geocentric universe, that's going to be truth. And if people says that astrology is true, that the movement of the moon and the stars determines my individual fate, that's what the LLM will spit back, right? And so again, it has no mechanism. I mean, people have tried to put in patches to try to clear up these types of problems and so-called hallucinations. But I do think that the voice and point of view is important there. But again, there'll be improvements with these technologies. So in some sense, it's an empirical question depending on context and so forth. So.
Well, very lovely discussion here. Very enjoyable. Kartik, you next?
Sure. Yep, sure thing. Thank you, Britt. So this question is for Teppo. So I'm trying to make meaning out of the presentation, and the two examples that you shared, I felt like they were closer to kind of paradigm change examples where the theory is massively changing from one paradigm to another paradigm. Is that a boundary condition that we are talking about in terms of theory development, or is that a norm? That's the first question. And kind of relatedly, the second question is, developing theory is inherently risky and costly. So one example that I can think of is when, I'm forgetting the name of the scientist, but when the structure of benzene was discovered, the scientist said that he saw that in his dream. Is that a human hallucination that we are then kind of equating as theory building? And then it was evidently empirically tested and figured out the shape of benzene. And right now we have a differential cost for algorithmic hallucinations. We do not value them. So where is that risk proposition? Where is that valuation of risk and cost of hallucination or theory building is located when we compare algorithms and humans? Hope that makes sense.
No, that's a fantastic question. So my co-author Matthias he's in machine learning, but his work is in operations, and so we had long conversations about sort of what are the kind of boundary conditions, exactly as you stated it, and we would argue that there's lots of routine, repetitive tasks, and those routine and repetitive tasks occur in our lives as researchers, but they occur in managerial environments as well. And so we think that there's lots of automation that will happen in those settings, right? But then it's the things that are at the forefront of knowledge, and these are the disruptive things. My examples are deliberately sort of, the Wright brothers and Galileo. It's just sort of just to highlight the point. And in part, I'm trying to take it out of this current context where we're so frenzied about what's going on. And I am equally frenzied, but then to sort of have these thought experiments to say, okay, in the end, this thing's been trained with existing knowledge, maybe all of it, right? So you've input all this existing knowledge. Its mechanism for still establishing truth is simply the past, or so stochastically sampling from how the word associations map the past in some sense, right? And so I think that there is a boundary condition there. But I wouldn't want to cede the point that I do think that in the small, that even sort of your average human beings in their lives are also engaging in some form of forward-looking kind of beliefs and theorizing in terms of how they engage with the world, including managers that have sort of kind of quasi proto-theories about how to create value for their firm. That's not Galileo, that's not the Wright brothers, but it's still nonetheless, trying to do something that hasn't existed in the past, right? And so I do think that there's kind of a division of labor, and I think there's boundary conditions. On the other point, in terms of risk or the dream point, I don't know if that's a Charles Peirce, who's this philosopher, pragmatist, along with Dewey, talked about how like humans have this natural propensity for imagining sort of theories, and so I don't have work on dreams or anything like that, but I do think that I sort of take that for granted, that there's this natural propensity, and why not take advantage of that? And in situations that are repetitive and so forth, yeah, let the AI do the data crunching and all of that. And so anyway, that's my, I guess, quick reaction. Lots of other thoughts. Send me a note offline, because I do have some other thoughts, but I don't want to hog all the time here. So thanks.
If I can add one little thing, like what about aren't there going to be some AI bots that's going to disrupt what knowledge is in there and just pump in fake information into the system that we then use as, a truth? I think we are underestimating the possibilities there of deliberately disrupting the basis of knowledge that AI accesses.
Okay, thank you. Megan?
Hi there. Thank you so much for this. This has been a really great presentations. My question is in particular to the editors. I was having a conversation with a colleague last week, and he's in the room as well, in case you want to come in with this as well. But about programming a bot to collect a very specific data set, and it was in an ethical gray zone. And I mean, I teach ethics, I do research on values in AI. Like, I'm very comfortable with these considerations, and it remains at the end of the day, it was a gray zone. I would have felt comfortable moving forward. It was a gray zone. So my question is, the risk remained with the publishing policies, because they are evolving. We're learning as we go, but I was afraid that if we collect this data, ethical gray zone, I'm not sure if it could be used. So how do we kind of navigate that? Because how do we navigate that exactly? I'm not sure if that was clear. I'm a little all over the place.
Sure. I can say something. I mean, that was exactly, these things were the motivation for us to come up with a policy in the first place and explain it through an editorial, knowing that given the rapid development of the field and what is possible and what not, and how creative people are in using AI for research in areas that not that we as editors know everything, right? We are aware that we couldn't capture each and every gray zone that you mentioned, and I would say specifically, if it's a gray zone, it would need to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But the best general guidance for this is the AI policy in the first place, that says, okay, we want full disclosure and transparency of what exactly you did. And then typically publishers, in our case, this would be Wiley or Sage, and you name them, to which the journals are subject to, or that count for the journals. They do have an ethics policy as well. So, I mean, I don't know your experiment or what you've been doing. If that would cause harm to people or animals, it would not be considered ethical. So I would have a deep look at both the AI policy and the more general ethics policy that most of the publishers have. So we don't have one specifically as a journal, but we subscribe to the one of our publisher. And then again, it's a case-by-case decision, probably in these regards. You can always reach out to either the editor-in-chief, you can reach out to the editorial manager of the journal and discuss it before you submit the paper, and see what they think about it, given that it's relatively complicated to give a very clear, like, yes, no answer to that.
And I think it's very important that you bring it up. I think this ethics is something we should definitely discuss, and the same with the legal part of this. Who's legally responsible for what? The publisher will start doing something. We as editors, what are we responsible for? And what are the authors responsible for? And yeah, we need to take this seriously. I don't think we can just rely on what we have already. It's and I think we need to really think about the whole system before, you know, before at the same time that we start running with it. It's very exciting right now, but there's a lot of risk too. Yeah. So I think thank you for bringing up the question.
So real quick thought here on sort of the broader implications of embracing this methodologically at this point in time when there's a lot of ambiguity at journal levels, across journals and even within journals over time. I think there's going to be a huge amount of ambiguity that authors have to wrestle with. And so the challenge for, I think, junior scholars that are running, headfirst into these opportunities, the risk is to treat them as methodological shortcuts, because I actually think it's going to increase the methodological burden on you in some ways, because you're going to have to triangulate and demonstrate that you can show similar results across multiple kinds of studies. So I think replication is going to be required for anybody who's embracing these initially, right? Anytime there's sort of methodological advancements, I mean, we saw this with QCA, for example, for those of you familiar with the method, right? It was very difficult to substantiate that within management journals at first. So Perfis had to build a whole community around QCA. He had to demonstrate how this method could be used in contrast to OLS regression and other kinds of quantitative analysis. So I think that there's there's going to actually be an increased burden in embracing this. So don't see it as a methodological shortcut at this point, because again, journals are all over the place on this, and that's going to continue to be the case until a lot of these discussions get resolved, which I don't foresee happening anytime soon.
Thank you. Howard?
Yes, I want to pick up on something that one of the commentators mentioned about humans tending to underestimate what's going to happen next, and tie that back into what Teppo started us out saying. It's a good reminder. What he pointed out is that LLMs are about language right now, mostly. The conversation here has mostly been about those kinds of models. But we've known for a long time, for decades from cognitive neuroscience, that a lot of thought is actually subconscious. In fact, most human thought is subconscious. And at one time, it may have been felt that people were using words in that process. But now we have recent research that shows that when you test people and see when they're thinking about something, parts of the brain light up that don't have to do with language. They have to do with emotions, with feelings, with emotion, with touch. And I think that's going to be that's the next frontier in the creative generative AI. So generative AI is not just about LLMs. Generative AI is about trying to teach some machines how to think in a more generic way. And so there are people working with this about trying to input a sense of motion into robots, trying to give them image. In fact, we're pretty far along with the machines recognizing images. And so when it's possible that in another couple of years, the issues that you've been raising about creativity, innovation, being stuck with only having to work with what's in the past will be perhaps an issue of the past, that it could be that the next stage is scientists getting really good at creating generative AI, which actually now can bring in things like touch, physicality, location, motion, vision. When all those things combine, I think we would be getting closer to the artificial generative intelligence, which is the ultimate concern of the people who are frightened of this. AGI, that's what, for example, that's what Elon Musk company is trying to work on now. So I just want to raise that to make people aware that don't be stuck with thinking about the language part of this. It's more than about language going forward with generative AI. It's about producing robots that have capabilities that have been undreamt of until the past couple of years.
Well, I think you're onto something very important here with the feelings and the emotions and the what I would call the embodied part. And I think it's not only that how do we include the embodied part in AI, I think it's also the type of knowledge that we will value in society. I think it's going to change the kind of things we will teach in the classrooms, and the kind of things we will test students on. I think all of this is changing because of AI. And I think we're going to see less emphasis on this abstract general knowledge about, natural law type thing of how the world works, and much more about what works for this person in the context of these feelings and this particular practice context, and value the use of this abstract knowledge that we get very readily from AI models, but we use it in a embodied and emotionally meaningful way. I think meaningfulness for human beings is going to be valued more, in my guess, and abstract knowledge less. So
I really like that you're saying this, Eva, because I think also in education, in our daily work, let's say, it's the same thing going on, right? We need to rediscover what is our role as teachers. And in a sense, it's not that new, because it has been going on for maybe decades, that, you have a lecture and then there's an assessment, and how the people cheated, they cheated for sure in different ways. And now it's really back to, what does it actually mean to be in a classroom in this embodied experience? And in that way, it might even be a good thing to have all this just as a point of, as a need for reflecting on what's actually the goal we want to achieve. That's what I sometimes ask myself. So great to have, artificial general intelligence, AGI, as how it says, but what for actually? What's the point? What's the purpose? And sometimes right now, for sure, in the LLM stuff, it's really not always clear what does it actually bring to the world, what impact can it help, which is a bit crazy. So in the chat there were quite a few comments on for example the impact of actually keeping these models running. That's bizarre in times of climate crisis, and so there's so much more to it. This whole thing is embedded in a social reality which we quickly forget, and connecting this to impact, I think that's a super important job we should keep in mind in the coming years.
I'll just quickly, I like both those points a lot, and just Howard's point about multimodality. The example that I had was kids encounter 15 to 20,000 words a day, but they also encounter lots of visual data and haptic data, and there's olfactory data. Like, there's all kinds of data. The question I would ask though is it data in the sense of these are sort of inputs, right? Because that's how it's treated. It's this input-output model, or is there something else fundamentally that's going on in terms of human learning? And that's a really fundamental question, right? And these connectionist models use it, focus on input-output. But anyway, but I like the multimodality point because I think it's critical. Yeah.
And it hasn't been brought up, but I think we should also think about, we will become dependent financially on AI tools very soon. And we're just trying to get out of our dependencies of publishers, but AI tools, they cost money to embrace for the universities and give us access to them, but it also costs money to get rid of them again. So we haven't, just to mess it up further, but I think we should start thinking about the bigger picture.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Christina and Eva just both make my point basically in my question. Oh, my daughter's coming in. I'm taking too long. But my question mainly revolves around, there's also materiality of AI. AI is there. The racks, the servers are there, and indeed, if we sort of building on that, they have a huge environmental impact, which to me is mind-boggling how this relates to our the whole idea of us helping to tackle grand challenges. We're just speeding up climate change like mad doing this. So I think directly by using AI, we do harm. It's not really an ethical question. We directly do harm to our environment. And so I feel we have an ethical obligation to say something and to think and to do, to address this as researchers. And well, for her, and I mean that's how that's my embodied experience here, and also this how we sort of the problem and the tool. So AI is our newest tool now, and our hammer. We seem to smash everything with it. Like, what's the actual problem we're trying to to solve here, and there's a finite amount of resources that we're working with, and we just seem to think that AI is something, I don't know, that doesn't exist, but it does exist. I mean, there's an infinite amount of. We need to use it carefully, just as we use human work power carefully. And I sometimes feel like we're not okay with like using cheap labor in somewhere else in the world, but we're okay with like letting AI do enormous amount of work for us for very unclear reasons. So maybe it's not really a question, or well, it's a concern. Like, how does this all relate? Like, where I'm getting confused. If anyone wants to say anything about it,
I think it's a fantastic point you made, Anne-Marie. Both with the environment, like we cannot at the same time say we want to protect the environment and then start embracing something that is, deliberately harming it. Like, what for? I think these are very important questions. What for? And the same with the research we produce. What for? What is the impact? It's moving forward rapidly. The impact of our research matters more than the knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And I think we're going to go more there, because we need to produce knowledge that is useful for us as human beings, as communities, as people, and not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And we have to consider the planet. And I think we will be spending more time thinking about what it is that we do in our profession, and what for, and where do we use the resources. So thank you for bringing this to the front.
Mariska?
Thank you. So thank you, Joop, and panelists, and Ebrat for this important discussion, and I'll build on Anne-Marie. While use cases and tools can be instrumentally interesting and professional guidelines are important, I feel an urgent need to grasp a working understanding of Gen AI at a higher level, and that's what I'm seeking from leading lights and from dialogue. AI represents both, for me, I see it as both grand challenges and grand opportunities. And what's facing us demands wisdom, scholarship and wisdom to make sense of generative artificial intelligence and its implications for democratization and access, but also homogenization of knowledge, environmental impacts through use, visuals and video creation, new opportunities and increased redundancies, as mentioned, and just many other, many positive and many negative implications. So what I'm wondering, if there was an interdisciplinary task force to deliberate on the values and ethics and implications of AI for social organizing and social change, what would such a task force look like in management and marketing? What sorts of knowledge and expertise would be at the table to design some of these guiding principles that we need?
These are great questions. I think we need to start there and start debating it at our conferences and our journals. What are the things we need? What matters? What for? I think you're asking all the right questions. And they're not easy to answer, but let's just start dialogues about it, because we need to.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, it seems like these conversations are happening in very distributed ways, and probably for good reason. I mean, I think that I would get nervous about any centralized body trying to own this conversation at this moment in time. That said, I mean, eventually we do as a field need some emerging consensus around how to deal with these things, because otherwise it's going to be incredibly challenging for authors and scholars to navigate the asymmetric landmines that are going to be scattered across our field of people either rejecting usage or embracing it. And so but at this point in time, you are asking the right questions, and I think that these conversations are happening just as they are today, in very kind of loosely coupled, decentralized fashion.
I think we can see from the discussion that a philosophical perspective is needed. And often I find that the conversations are idiosyncratic and use case and tools and kind of figuring out the professional realm. But I feel it's part of our responsibility to think of it in a higher way.